My parents disowned me for marrying a high school dropout, while my sister married a scientist. Months later, when he said, "We fund her lab now," they left the room quietly. I 42 female, I married a kind, brilliant mechanic with no formal education. My academic parents disowned me, idolizing my younger sister's marriage to a European scientist. Years later, my husband and I built a successful lab that my sister's husband now helps fund. When he made that announcement in front of my parents, they walked out without a word. "You know they're never going to accept me, right?" Jaden's voice was quiet. We were sitting on the tiny balcony of my old one-bedroom apartment in Spokane, a bowl of cold pasta between us. It was late summer, and the sunset was soaking the sky in orange. I stared out at the horizon for a second before answering. "No. But that's not going to stop me." I meant it. I still mean it. But back then, I didn't understand just how deep that rift would cut, or how long it would take to stitch it back together, if ever. My parents, Helena and Raymond, were academic through and through. They lived in a restored Victorian house near the University of Oregon campus in Eugene, the same university where they both taught. Their life was filled with bookshelves, grant deadlines, and dinner conversations about peer-reviewed journals. My mother quoted 19th century literature over tea, and my father once corrected my pronunciation of epistemology during a Christmas toast. Growing up, I never quite fit. I was smart, yes, but I wasn't driven in the way they respected. I asked too many what-if questions, challenged assumptions, and often ended up elbows deep in extracurriculars that didn't lead to awards. I liked science because it was full of things we didn't know yet, not because I wanted to impress someone with a research paper. My sister Alina, on the other hand, was their ideal. She didn't just play by the rules, she wrote new ones and then aced the test. Her accolades began before puberty. National science fairs, early college classes, Ivy League scholarships. By 25, she had her PhD in biophysics. At 27, she married Dorian, a Swiss-born scientist with a flawless academic record, impeccable manners, and a surname that sounded like it belonged on a building. They were proud. So proud. Her wedding was practically a conference of scholars, wine snobs, and the occasional Nobel hopeful. I remember standing near the cake table that night, watching my parents beam at her like she'd cracked the code to life itself. I was 34 when I met Jaden. And to my parents, it was as if I'd dropped out of the family tree entirely. I'd gotten a flat tire outside Wenatchee, returning from a low-budget conference where I'd presented research on viral protein mapping. I was frustrated, hungry, and pacing around my rental car when Jaden pulled over. He wore work boots, jeans streaked with oil, and a backwards cap. He barely looked at me before popping my trunk, checking the spare, and offering to fix the tire. I offered to pay. He refused. "Just promise not to scream if you hear me singing in the garage next time." He flashed a smile that made me laugh for the first time in days. We started seeing each other soon after. He was rough around the edges but impossibly kind. When I was buried in lab data, he'd bring sandwiches and just sit quietly with me. When my grant was rejected, he told me I was still the smartest person he knew. When I had a breakthrough on a protein variant I'd been studying for months, he cried before I did. He told me once, "You don't need someone who matches your resume. You need someone who matches your energy." I remember that night because I wrote it down in a notebook and underlined it 3 times. He didn't graduate high school. His dad died of a stroke when he was 17, and Jaden dropped out to run the family auto shop. He kept it afloat while raising his 2 younger brothers. By the time I met him, he had turned the shop into a growing business with 5 full-time employees, health benefits, and a reputation for never overcharging. He could take apart an engine blindfolded and rebuild it better than before. But none of that mattered to my parents. I told them about Jaden over the phone. I was pacing outside my apartment, heart pounding, hoping, crap, that they'd surprise me. Instead, I got silence. Then, "A mechanic?" my dad asked. "Is this dot serious?" "It's not about his job," I said. "He's kind. He's smart in ways you don't see in classrooms. My mom chimed in, trying to sound calm. You've always had potential, Nora. Don't throw it away for, what is this, a fling? That conversation ended with my father saying he needed time to process. A week later, they called again, not to talk, but to tell me they couldn't support my decision. That if I married him, I was choosing to sever ties. And I did. Jaden and I had a small courthouse wedding. My best friend Sadie was my maid of honor. His brother stood beside him. We had burgers and beer afterward, and I danced with him in our living room until we were both laughing too hard to keep going. I sent my parents a photo. They never responded. For a while, it was hard. There were days when I missed my mother's voice so badly it hurt. Nights when I dreamed my father had called to tell me he was proud. I'd wake up with a lump in my throat, Jaden sleeping beside me, unaware of how broken I still felt. But we built our life anyway. We moved to Seattle after I landed a position in a biotech company that promised more independence. Jaden opened a second shop. I poured myself into research, eventually focusing on a project that explored virus-neutralizing agents in high-risk populations. 3 years in, I was given a small lab team. The work we did started to gain traction. First an article in a respected journal. Then, attention from a couple of investors. My lab was granted expansion funding. I hired interns. We applied for patents. Jaden? He supported me through every moment. He handled our finances while I buried myself in data. He brought food to my desk and massaged my neck when I was hunched over code for hours. He never once made me feel guilty for chasing something I loved. He told people proudly, my wife? She's working on the stuff that's going to change lives. Then Alina called. It had been years, 4, maybe 5, since we'd had a real conversation. She sounded tired, uncertain. Her voice had lost that sharp edge I'd grown up with. Her lab at MIT had lost major funding. Her nanotech project had stalled, and her team was being cut. She and Dorian had moved back to Portland while she looked for new backing. I heard about your lab, she said after a long pause. I was quiet. It's impressive, Nora. Really? You've done well. She came to visit with Dorian a few weeks later. They stayed in our guest room, ate dinner with us at our long oak table. I saw her watching Jaden, curiously, not judgmentally. For once, there was no pretense between us. Dorian was the one who suggested we collaborate. He had contacts, real ones, with access to a funding pipeline in Zurich. He wanted to invest in my lab. Not as charity. As a partnership. We believe in what you're doing, he said. And it's time people stop confusing titles with talent. I'll never forget the moment he said it. We were sitting in my office, the lab buzzing just outside the glass walls. My team was prepping a new batch of samples, while Dorian sat across from me, papers in front of him, and Jaden at my side. Alina watched from the corner, arms crossed but soft-eyed. We'd like to fund your lab's next phase, Dorian said. Full backing. Joint venture, equal credit, open source data sharing between teams. You'd remain in full operational control. It was more than generous, it was unprecedented. I glanced at Jaden, whose face said everything I was feeling: disbelief, relief, validation. It was the first time in my life I truly saw the tides turning. Dorian wasn't doing this to rescue us. He was doing it because, despite my unconventional path, my work had value. It was a quiet, powerful recognition, not just of me, but of Jaden too. Of everything we had built from what the world said we couldn't. A few weeks later, we decided to host a dinner in Seattle to celebrate the partnership. We invited investors, colleagues, even a few early benefactors. At Jaden's suggestion, though I was reluctant, we invited my parents. I didn't expect them to come. But they did. They arrived stiff, uncertain. My mother wore her pearl earrings. My father looked thinner than I remembered. Their eyes scanned the room cautiously, as if they were stepping into enemy territory. Jaden greeted them kindly, offering them drinks. My mother accepted, her hands trembling slightly. My father nodded but avoided eye contact with me at first. The room filled with laughter and conversations, scientists talking tech with mechanics, investors mingling with interns. Jaden moved through the crowd like he belonged there, because he did. His presence grounded the evening. His charisma, quiet but unshakable, made even the most elite guests lean in. At dinner, we took turns giving short speeches. My lab manager thanked the team. I gave a short, heartfelt toast about perseverance, gratitude, and the beauty of unconventional partnerships. Then Dorian stood. He spoke calmly, directly, in his crisp Swiss accent that my mother used to swoon over. "It is an honor to support this lab," he said. "We believe deeply in Nora's work and in the environment she and Jaden have created here. This isn't just a scientific success, it's a human one. And yes." He paused for effect, turning slightly toward my parents without looking directly at them. "We fund her lab now." The room fell quiet for a beat. Then came polite applause. But my parents sat frozen. My mother looked down. My father's face turned the shade of weathered stone. He stood up quietly. My mother followed, not saying a word. They walked out. They didn't say goodbye. That night, I didn't cry. Jaden sat beside me on the couch after everyone had left, his arm draped over my shoulders, rubbing slow circles into my back. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, not because I was fine, but because I was done letting their silence define me. "I think I'm finally free," I whispered. He pulled me closer, resting his chin on my head. "You were always free, Nora. You just didn't know it yet." The days that followed were quiet in an oddly peaceful way. I didn't hear from my parents for a while. I didn't expect to. But something had shifted, not just for them, but for me. I had stopped needing their approval. Somewhere along the way, I'd grown into someone who could love them, grieve them, and still live without them. Then, about 2 weeks later, I got a letter. Handwritten. No return address. It was from my mother. There were only 6 words: "We were wrong. Please forgive us." I read it 3 times. Jaden found me at the kitchen counter, the letter in my hand, my eyes still dry. I didn't know what to say. "Do you want to call them?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "Not yet." He didn't push. He just nodded and turned on the kettle. Alina came back a few times over the following months. Sometimes with Dorian, sometimes alone. We had long, meandering conversations late into the night about regret, family pressure, and what it really meant to love someone without conditions. She admitted things I never thought I'd hear. "That night you told them you were marrying Jaden. I wanted to defend you. But I was scared. Scared they'd turn on me, too." I didn't judge her. I understood. She asked me once, "Do you ever resent me? For how they treated you versus me?" I answered honestly. "Sometimes. But I think they didn't know any better. And you didn't either." She nodded. "I do now." There was no dramatic reunion, no teary apology dinner. Just time. Letters. A few awkward phone calls. And a slow, careful reintroduction of my parents into my life, on my terms. They came to see my lab eventually. Just once. My dad stayed quiet, mostly. My mom asked 1,000 questions, and I answered them all, not to impress her, but because I was proud. They saw Jaden differently now. My mother asked him about his shop. My father shook his hand without looking like he was swallowing nails. Progress was slow, like thawing ice. Nothing dramatic. No lightning strikes of revelation. But it came, in little ways. After they visited the lab, my mother sent me a book, The Emperor of All Maladies, with a sticky note that read, "Remind me of the way you talk about your research." It was the first time in years she acknowledged my work with anything more than silence. A small gesture, but to me, it felt like 1,000 words of reconciliation. My father took longer. He never apologized outright. That just wasn't who he was. But a few months after that visit, I got a forwarded article from him. A study on virus-resistant cells in agricultural environments. He highlighted a section in yellow and wrote, "Interesting angle. Might pair well with your pathogen resistance work." It wasn't an apology. But it was an olive branch. From him, it was practically a song. Jaden took it all in stride. He never once gloated, never said, "I told you so." That wasn't his style. If anything, he was gentler with me during those months, sensing the emotional weight of those tiny exchanges. We were building something that mattered, not just the lab, not just the research, but something deeper. A family of our own, not bound by blood or expectation, but by choice, by trust, by the invisible threads of respect that held everything together. One evening, I came home to find Jaden on the porch, wiping his hands with a rag, a cup of coffee balanced on the railing. "Your mom called," he said casually. I blinked. "What?" "Yeah. Wanted to know what kind of air compressor we use in the garage." He grinned. "Said she's looking into buying one for your dad for his project." My mind was spinning. "He has a project?" Jaden chuckled. "Apparently he's restoring an old Vespa." I stared at him, stunned. My dad? The same man who once said anything with an engine was a distraction for the intellectually stunted? Jaden shrugged, sipping his coffee. Hey, maybe he finally realized that engines are just puzzles you can ride. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Despite the shift, I never stopped feeling the undercurrent of everything that had come before, the judgment, the disownment, the years of silence. It didn't vanish just because they were trying now. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a light switch. It's more like erosion, gradual, uneven, and unpredictable. Alina was different, though. We became closer than we ever had been as kids. Maybe it was because we both knew what it felt like to be measured by our accomplishments. Or maybe because we were finally able to be sisters, not competitors. One night she stayed over after a conference in Seattle. We drank wine on my back porch and talked about the lives we might have had. The roads we almost took. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I used to think success meant being the smartest person in the room." "And now?" I asked. She looked over at me, eyes shining. "Now I think it means choosing the right room." I smiled, leaning back against my chair. Jaden would have said the same thing. Only with more grease stains. We laughed. It felt honest. Meanwhile, the lab grew. With the funding from Dorian's firm and a few successful partnerships, we expanded our team, launched a second study, and started working closely with underserved communities in the Pacific Northwest. Jaden, ever the quiet supporter, handled our logistics, helped me set up donation programs, and even taught weekend workshops to local high schoolers, mechanics on Saturdays, basic science on Sundays. The kids loved him. One girl, Maya, a junior from Tacoma, told me after a session, "Mr. Jaden makes things make sense. Like, I didn't think I was smart before, but he said I just needed different tools." I told her, "He does that for everyone." And he did. Especially for me. Eventually, my parents invited us to dinner. It was their first time hosting us in their home in nearly a decade. Jaden hesitated at first. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I nodded. "Yeah. But only if you come too." The house was the same, oak floors polished to perfection, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, classical music humming from somewhere unseen. But the air was different. Warmer, somehow. My mom had cooked chicken marsala, Jaden's favorite, though I never told her that. My dad opened a bottle of Oregon Pinot and poured it without ceremony. We sat at the same table where, years ago, they had lectured me about choosing the wrong path. Now, we sat together, not entirely healed, but no longer broken. Dinner was surprisingly easy. They asked Jaden about his shops. My father, red wine in hand, actually asked him how to remove oxidation from brass fixtures on the Vespa. My mom showed us pictures of her garden. We talked about the weather, the news, politics, even. It wasn't profound, but it was normal. And after everything, that normalcy felt extraordinary. Later that night, as we left, my mother hugged me longer than she ever had. "We're proud of you," she whispered into my shoulder. "Both of you." I didn't say anything right away. I was afraid if I spoke, I'd cry. Jaden slipped his hand into mine as we walked down the front steps. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like reminders of how far we'd come. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. More than okay. My relationship with my parents had morphed into something tentative and polite. There were no more overt criticisms, but there was still a carefulness to everything. They never talked about the years of silence, never asked about the wedding they skipped or the birthdays they ignored. I think, in their own way, they believed their presence now would somehow cancel out their absence then. I wasn't ready to give them that pass. Jaden never pushed me about it. He stayed exactly as he always had, steady, present, willing to meet people where they were but never where they pretended to be. He was patient, even with them. One Sunday, we hosted a barbecue. My lab team came, a few of our neighbors, Jaden's brothers, and, surprisingly, Alina and my parents. It was the first time the entire family had been in our backyard. I watched my father pick at a plate of grilled vegetables while Jaden explained his latest garage renovation to my mother, who asked follow-up questions like she actually cared. Alina was the glue that day. She floated between groups, easing tension, casually reminding everyone we were just people, not rival theories in some peer-reviewed family journal. At one point, Jaden and I stepped inside to grab more plates. I paused at the sink, looking out the window at the backyard. "They don't know how to apologize," I said quietly. Jaden was stacking napkins beside me. "Some people don't," he replied. "They just show up and hope it's enough." I turned to him. "Is it?" He didn't answer right away. Then he shrugged. "It's a start. But it's not your job to make it enough." That hit me harder than I expected. At work, the lab was thriving. Our virus-neutralizing project had advanced past our initial expectations, and the early trials were showing promising results. The nonprofit we created with Dorian and Alina was gaining traction, and I started getting invited to panels and summits I never would have been considered for 5 years ago. And still, Jaden never tried to stand in the spotlight. When people at conferences asked, "And what do you do?" he'd smile and say, "I'm the support crew. I keep the engine running while she flies the plane." It always got a laugh. But there was truth to it. One night after a long day of meetings and grant calls, I found Jaden in the garage, sleeves rolled up, music playing low, elbow deep in the Vespa project he'd taken over from my dad. "You know," he said without looking up, "I think your old man actually likes this thing now. Might even ask me to help him tune it next time." I leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. "Would you do it?" He paused, turning toward me. "Yeah. If he asks for help, I will." "What if he never says he's sorry?" Jaden wiped his hands with a cloth and gave me a small smile. "I'm not waiting for an apology to live my life. Are you?" I didn't answer. Not then. But I carried that question with me into the next few weeks, and it haunted me more than I cared to admit. Then came a moment I didn't expect. My dad invited us over. Just us. No Alina, no Dorian, no lab talk. Just dinner. I was suspicious, but Jaden encouraged me to go. "It might be nothing," he said. "Or it might be something." We arrived to find my father in the kitchen, apron on, stirring a pot of something that smelled like tomato and garlic. My mother set the table, and for once, there were no wine pairings, no lectures on fermentation, no passive-aggressive remarks about our career choices. Dinner was quiet. Not awkward, just understated. And when dessert came out, a simple apple crumbled, my father did something he'd never done before. He sat down, looked directly at Jaden, and said, "Thank you for taking care of her." I froze. Jaden, ever calm, nodded. "She takes care of me, too." My dad nodded slowly. "That's good. That's how it should be." It wasn't a grand gesture. But it was the first real acknowledgement of Jaden's place in my life, of our life together. After we left, I didn't say much in the car. Jaden didn't press. When we got home, I sat on the edge of the bed and just let myself feel it, how strange it was to finally be seen, not as a disappointment, but as someone who had built something meaningful. Not alone, but with someone the world said wasn't worthy. In the lab, progress continued. One of our latest protein models started attracting the attention of a major global health initiative. Alina and I started co-authoring papers. Dorian began guest lecturing remotely for a biotech course we designed together. It was surreal. The lines that once separated our lives, academic versus applied, respected versus ridiculed, were blurring into something shared. Jaden stayed out of the publications, the speaking circuits, the academic noise. But his fingerprints were everywhere, on the systems he helped organize, the community events he co-hosted, the balance he gave me when I started slipping into that old rhythm of overwork. One day, while going through files in the office, I found a notebook. It was mine, from years ago. Inside, under a page of scratched-out formulas and brainstorms, was a quote I'd written in my early days with Jaden: "You don't need someone who matches your resume. You need someone who matches your energy." I stared at it for a long time. It was a massive gathering. Scientists, private sector innovators, philanthropists, and policymakers from around the world all in one place. For years, this summit had been dominated by institutions like Harvard, Stanford, and the Swiss Federal Institute. The kind of places my parents talked about over wine, the places Alina had been invited to long before I was ever on their radar. But this year, something changed. My lab had been selected to headline one of the summit's keynote panels. The topic: unconventional innovation in disease prevention. I was shocked. Flattered. Nervous. When the email came through, I read it twice and then called Jaden. He listened silently, then said, "Of course they picked you. About time." We were invited not just to speak, but to showcase. An entire section of the expo hall was reserved for our team: posters, video demonstrations, early-stage data models. Dorian and Alina were joining us. Investors, collaborators, journalists, all scheduled to meet us. It was our moment. And, like all full-circle stories tend to go, my parents decided to attend. At first, I thought they were coming out of obligation. Support, in their own quiet way. But then I found out something interesting. My father had applied to present at the summit. And had been turned down. Alina told me in confidence. He submitted a review on hybrid chemical diagnostics. They said it was outdated. Politely, but still. I didn't take pleasure in it, not exactly. But I felt justified. For once, the world that had always applauded my father was now turning its eyes elsewhere. The day of the keynote came, and the conference center buzzed with the kind of anxious excitement I usually associated with major discoveries or Nobel announcements. Jaden wore a tailored navy jacket I'd bought him months ago but that he'd insisted was too fancy to ever wear. He looked good in it. Confidence. The kind of man people notice, not for his title, but for his presence. My parents arrived just before the panel began. They sat toward the front, beside Alina and Dorian, stiff and quiet. I stepped onto the stage. The presentation began with a short video reel: our lab, our outreach, the lives our programs had impacted. One clip showed Jaden in the shop, surrounded by students. Another showed him helping me solder connections for a prototype testing device we'd been developing for field use. It wasn't just about science, it was about community, resourcefulness, and real-world application. When the video ended, the applause started slowly, then built. I spoke for 20 minutes about protein modeling, access to treatment in rural areas, the importance of cross-disciplinary collaboration. I kept my voice steady. I spoke clearly. I didn't oversell. When I finished, I introduced Dorian and Alina, who added their perspective. And then, as a final surprise, I introduced Jaden. There were murmurs in the crowd. It was unusual. A keynote featuring someone with no formal education. No degrees. Just lived experience. He stepped up to the mic, took a moment to scan the audience, and said, "I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm a mechanic. I fix things." But for years, I watched Nora try to fix things too, just on a different scale. I watched her work long nights, run out of funding, fight for her place in rooms that didn't want to let her in. She kept going. And I helped however I could. Because she saw value in me when others didn't. She built something real. And now, the rest of the world is just catching up. There was silence at first. Then someone stood. Clapped. Another. Then another. A standing ovation. My parents remained seated. My father's hands were clasped tightly. My mother blinked hard, like she wasn't sure how to respond. I saw something in their faces I hadn't seen before. Not just a surprise, but realization. After the panel, journalists lined up for interviews. Investors asked about scaling our field tools. Several university chairs approached me about guest lecturing. One even offered Jaden a position to help design a new community systems tech course. He politely declined. "Teaching isn't my thing," he said, smiling. "But I'll visit if there's pizza." My parents waited quietly near the back. I didn't rush to them. I let them come to me. When they did, my mother was the first to speak. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I didn't know it would be like that." "You didn't want to know," I replied, not unkindly. She nodded, accepting it. My father cleared his throat. "You've done something impressive, Nora." And we judged it before we understood it. That might have been the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from him. Jaden stood beside me, not saying anything. My dad turned to him. "You spoke well." Jaden raised an eyebrow. "Thanks. Wasn't trying to." That made my father chuckle. Just a little. Then he offered his hand. Jaden shook it. And in that handshake, something old died quietly, and something new began to grow. The rest of the summit was a blur of congratulations and business cards. Our project was officially greenlit for global trial implementation. A funder from Scandinavia wanted to replicate our model. We were invited to the UN's Health Innovation Forum the following year. It was more than I ever imagined. But the part that stayed with me most wasn't the accolades. It was that, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, by the world, yes, but more importantly, by the people who had once cast me out. I didn't have to scream to be heard anymore. I had built something louder than words, a life they couldn't ignore. We flew home the next day, exhausted and full of quiet joy. As the plane climbed above the clouds, Jaden leaned his head against the window and said, "So, do you think we're finally done proving ourselves?" I looked at him, at the man who had been my anchor, my mirror, my partner in every way that mattered. "No," I said. "I think we stopped needing to." He smiled, eyes closing. "Good." That was getting tiring. And for the first time in years, I leaned back in my seat and let myself rest. Not because the fight was over, but because we had already won.